Good evening and welcome. Buenas noches, bienvenidos a todos. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I do want to let everyone know, as Mr. Ortega has said, I'm Hilda, sorry, introduce myself, Hilda Maldonado, Superintendent for Santa Barbara Unified. Um, in recent years, we have really been observing how our grading systems that have been used for almost hundreds of years now, I should say, have traditionally uh, been used in a way that there's disparate outcomes for many students. The pandemic experience really showed us how inherently inequitable these things are. And this is true in Santa Barbara Unified, but also in districts across California and our country. This has prompted Ed Services, with the great leadership of Assistant Superintendent Sean Carey and others, to really begin a concerted examination of our grading practices and the impact that they have on students. It included a board study session last March, professional learning for teachers and students and teachers and administrators last summer, and tonight you're going to get to hear more about this work. I want to give you a quick personal story as a former teacher myself. When I was working with English learners in the elementary schools, for example, and we were looking at issues like phonemic awareness and phonics, which are the ways that kids learn to read, having to grade kids who don't yet speak English because their pronunciation of the letter sounds, which can be very difficult in some cases, because of the way that the assessments were designed, was difficult, particularly as a bilingual student myself. And so there's so many things we need to consider when we think about the act of teaching and learning between a student and a teacher. And I'm so hopeful and grateful to the work that's been going on, to Joe Feldman and his group, to the teachers and administrators who've been really leaning in hard into this work and are doing it with very great intentions on how we make this teaching and learning and grading an act of learning that leads us to just a better society and better outcomes for all. So with that, I'm going to turn the meeting back to our hosts, and thank you everyone for being here tonight.
Thank you, Ms. Maldonado. And I do want to just make a public comment that if you do have questions throughout this presentation, there is a Q&A icon at the bottom, and you can click on that and you could ask questions. And we do have panelists here that will be able to look at your questions and either answer them through the presentation or at the end of the presentation, or get back to you after the presentation.
Well, hello. Well, thank you, Dr. Maldonado, for really creating this opportunity for the teachers and particularly for this event to help parents and families learn a little bit more about the research and experiences and what does it mean to have grading become more equitable. My name is Joe Feldman. I'm a former high school English and American history teacher. I currently live in Oakland, but I did my teaching in Atlanta public schools and in New York. And I was a principal in Northern California, where I live now, and also worked in the central office in New York City. And as a teacher, as an administrator, and now even as a parent, I have a fifth grader and a ninth grader children. And it has always been some confusion around grading. And as a teacher and principal, I realized that I had never gotten any training on how to grade. And so since 2013, I started researching and now lead an organization that partners with schools and districts across the country in helping their grading become more accurate and bias resistant and motivating. Because as Dr. Maldonado said, we are using a set of grading practices that are really over 100 years old, which I'll talk a little bit about later today. So we work now with districts and schools across the country. So Santa Barbara is only one of many districts for whom the pandemic has really highlighted how our historical grading practices are making teaching and learning more difficult and adding more stress to our students unnecessarily. And so now you can see that we work with large districts like New York City and LA Unified and Chicago public schools, as well as suburban districts, rural, independent schools across the country, including like Harvard-Westlake in LA, and post-secondary institutions. So we work with the California Community Colleges Acceleration Project. We also have worked with Cal Berkeley as some of the regional partners. So there's a whole lot of interest in improving how we grade our students. And even though I'll put up this slide at the end for people who are interested, you can follow on Twitter or join the Facebook group or find out more information on our website. All right, so now to get to the good stuff. So we're going to be covering a lot of ground as this introduction. We're going to do an activity around grading and then talk about what is equitable grading, what's the framework and design, and what's an example of more equitable grading practices, as well as what the district has engaged in over this year, and then have time for questions. And I want to thank everybody for joining today. I know that at the end of a long day, to now tune into a Zoom meeting is not your first choice, maybe, but I'm so grateful for those of you who have found the time and energy and space to join. And if you're eating dinner or having a glass of wine over this, perfect. There's no expectation except you just be curious and open to some of these ideas. This is not going to be a comprehensive and complete information session. The work of equitable grading is incredibly complex, and it can't be done in a short period of time like this. And it's not going to be a full opportunity to have every possible question answered. This is an introduction to the what, why, and how of equitable grading. It's a lens you can use when thinking about your child's grades and even reflecting on your own experience being graded. And it's also some vocabulary that maybe you can use and can resonate with you, and have more productive discussions with your children about the grades that they receive. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is a short activity. So we're going to do what's called a free write. And this is something that your children may have done at some point in their academic careers, and you may have even done it. But the idea is you'll need something to write with and something to write on. So any piece of paper works, and any pen or pencil, if you'd rather just type into a Google Doc. If you feel like it, it's just kind of a cool activity to do. So what it's going to be is that I'm going to give you a question, and I'm going to give you 90 seconds to respond to the question. The trick of this, what makes a free write different than other activities, is that the task is to just write without stopping. Because research suggests that many times we censor ourselves, we stop ourselves from writing because we're thinking and like, oh, is that a good idea? Maybe that's not a good idea. And so in this, you're supposed to write whatever comes to your mind, even if you say, I don't know what else to say. I wish I had eaten more, or whatever you want to say. All right. So that's what a free write is. So get ready, because I'm going to explain the question, and then I'm going to give you 90 seconds to write about it. Okay. So here's the question, and I'll explain it a little bit first. So the prompt is to write about a specific experience that you have had related to receiving a grade as a student or as a parent or caregiver of a student that was very powerful for you, either very positive or negative. And a couple of things about this. First of all, it could be a grade on a test, a homework assignment, a project, a report card, an essay, a transcript, at any kind of grade. And it could have been from when you were a kindergartner or your child was a kindergartner, all the way up till high school or beyond if you went to school then. And when you're thinking about it and remembering this, I want you to think about it in two ways. First is, what emotions were coming up for you in that powerful experience? And how do you think about it now? All right, so I want you to write about a specific experience related to receiving a grade that was either very positive or negative. And I'm going to give you 90 seconds now to write about it. Go. About 15 more seconds. All right, so wrap up your idea or your reflection or your thought. And now what we'd like people to use is to use a Padlet. So what we'd like you to do is there's a link that's now in the chat. And we want you to, and I'll even show you this because I know some people may not be as familiar with Padlets. So hang on here. So when you click the link that's in the chat, you'll see this. And down in the bottom right, you'll see a plus sign. So you'll click the plus sign, and then you can type, what I'd like you to type is 1 to 2 words to describe your powerful experience. Y palabras en español están bien. And once you type your word in, right? Right, then you just put publish, and there it is. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a chance to write 1 to 2 words to describe your powerful experience. About another 10 seconds to see some more. Thank you for sharing, those who've shared. Well, 1 to 2 words describe your experience. All right. Keep them coming. Muchas gracias, and thank you for putting in your words. And one of the reasons why we do this is because it's pretty clear that people felt something strong related to their grades that they've gotten. And as you know, grades can cause a lot of stress. They can change how we think about ourselves. It can change how we think about and affect how we think about school and our teachers and the subject. It may be that if you got a certain kind of grade, you felt like you were really powerful in that subject, or that subject was not for you. And students are experiencing these all the time, every day. And oftentimes we're aware of them, and oftentimes we have no idea what our students are experiencing. And it's really important that we talk specifically about grades in this way. So thank you for sharing, and I'm going to head back to my PowerPoint. And that's just one reason why talk about grading, because for a lot of folks, grading seems like this final thing that happens, right? A student does a bunch of work, and then they get a bunch of points, and then how many points did they get over how many were possible? And it's a percentage, like you got an 88%, and there's your grade, and that's it. And grading seems like just this kind of numerical calculation of points that you've earned. But it's actually very complex. When a teacher is deciding grading, they're not just giving points or taking away points. They're thinking about how many points is this worth, and what happens when a student turns in something late, or what kind of category does this go in? Anytime a teacher asks a student to do anything, they have to decide, am I going to grade this or not? So it's really part of every instructional decision every day in every classroom for every student. And one of the challenges is that in most professional training programs for teachers, they get almost no training in how to grade, because it has always historically been thought of as just like, oh, it's this final thing. Like you do your teaching, your great teaching, and you do your great curriculum, and you do your great instruction, and then you can figure out on your own how to do the grading. But it's actually so important that we know how to do this as teachers, but no one trains us on how. And so what happens much of the time is that teachers will simply repeat how they were graded. So if a teacher gave them 5 points if you turn something in late, then a teacher feels like, well, I guess I should do the same thing. And so that just happens over and over and over. And it's also important for us to talk about grading in the context of equity, because in many ways, the grading system that we used is an artifact of a 100-year-old system, when we had certain beliefs about groups of people that we now don't believe anymore, right? We believe that groups of people, Black students, Latinx, Indigenous folks, and other students of color, as well as low-income students, or students from lower income families or whose first language wasn't English, we believed that we didn't expect as much from them. And we believe that they weren't as capable. And we now know that that is totally untrue, and every student can be successful. The problem is that we're using a grading system that wasn't built for that. It was actually built to have certain achievement disparities in the system itself. This is a quote that we talk about a lot. All organizations are perfectly designed to get the results they get. We should talk about grading more critically, not just because teachers need more support in thinking about it, and it's hugely important for our students, but if we don't talk about it, it will simply perpetuate the disparities that are happening historically over decades in our schools. And what's happening actually is that the grading system that we use today in many cases, because it is over 100 years old, it is actually perpetuating achievement and opportunity gaps without us realizing it. Our traditional grading practices reward students with privilege and resources and punish those who don't have those resources. And it actually makes it harder for students who have fewer resources and privilege from becoming successful. So this work is about really understanding, why do we have this grading system that we've inherited, and what is it doing in our classrooms? Because when you think about it, we have had huge changes to our schools, right? We have unbolted the desks, which was actually a big deal. Back in the early 1900s, they thought that if you unbolted desks, students would just run around because they couldn't sit still long enough, right? But we don't think that now. And the way students access information, students aren't bringing home huge backpacks full of 6 and 7 books, right? And the way students are interacting in classrooms and what they're doing and what the teacher is doing is totally different, but our report cards are almost identical. So the report card on the left is from 1918, and the one on the right is from a century later, right? Subject, letter, and maybe a cumulative calculation, right? So I don't have time to go into all the history right now, but this grading system began in the Industrial Revolution, when we were trying to build large schools imitating a factory model, and we were getting lots of immigration and lots of folks from rural areas, and we're trying to build systems so that we could prepare students for the factories, for the assembly lines. And because we were trying to do that, when we apply that to our modern era, it is actually constraining teaching, inhibiting learning, and hurting our most vulnerable students without even realizing it. And I want to talk about a couple of ways it's doing that, and these may resonate with you as you've watched your own children. So I'm going to talk about 4 ways. The first is that grading is a commodity. The second is that it's providing misleading information about our students, our children's learning. Grades are variable from teacher to teacher, and it adds unnecessary stress. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. So the first is that grading is a commodity, and teachers are the vendors of this. So when my son, who's now a 5th grader, was a kindergartner, I went into his classroom to volunteer when he was in kindergarten, and kids were excited about all kinds of learning. The teacher would introduce some new thing and the kids would be all over it and so excited to learn. No kid raised their hand and asked, how many points do I get for this? Right? There is no conversation of points at all. Students are just excited to learn. In upper elementary school, teachers started introducing the idea of points. You get 3 points for doing something. And if you turn in something late, you lose a point. Or if you come in on time, you get points. Or if you're late, if you line it up slowly for recess, you lose points. And all of this conversation around points blossoms in middle school and high school, where everything is worth points. You got a 42 out of 60, a 76 out of 80. You handed in something late, you lose 10 points. You do extra credit. You brought in cans of soup for the food drive, you get 5 points, right? Everything is points, no matter what. And so students, even though they started talking about learning by being curious, by the time they get to middle school, and certainly in high school, it is all about getting as many points as I can, whatever way I can get them. And students have apps on their phone where they can look at like, oh, I got an 88 today and I'm watching it like the stock market. Tomorrow I might get an 89 or I might get a 91. What do I have to get on the next test? They start arguing with my teacher. Can I get 10 more points for extra credit? What do I need to do to get an A? And they're all stressed about getting all these points. And we have taught them that the success in schools is only described as getting as many points as possible. It's not about learning. So that's one aspect of our inherited grading system, is teaching students about just get the points. A second aspect of our inherited system is it actually provides misleading information, unfortunately, about our children. So when you think about it, what's in a grade? Well, it's certainly how well a student did in the course, right? How much they learned about the content. But teachers include a lot of other information, like did they come on time to class? Did they have their homework done? Did they have their notebook ready? Did they participate in the group work? Did they do the extra credit? How hard do I think they worked, right? All this other stuff. And so what happens is their teachers are combining so many different things together that it's difficult to understand what a grade means. So for example, one teacher might say, well, I'm going to take off 10 points if you hand in something late. So a student who hands in something on time, who gets B-level work, would have a B. The student who does exemplary on the work, but hands it in a day late, would also have a B. So now you have two students who have a B, who are entirely different from each other. A grade is supposed to capture, did they hand in something on time, as well as did they learn, as well as did they raise their hand, or if they didn't raise their hand, right? All this stuff is together. Plus, every teacher is grading differently. And you may have experienced this as a parent, where you could have the same student in two different teachers' classrooms, even having identical performance. And yet, because the grading systems are different, a student could get different grades. And the students know that this is happening. Here's a quote from a student. Every teacher has their own way of grading, which I think is confusing to the students. When you first change classes, you don't know how that teacher is going to grade the homework, so you don't really know how to do it as far as making sure all your answers are right. Because some teachers, they don't grade the homework at all. They look through the homework and, oh, you tried 100%. And other teachers are, no, you have to get this homework exactly right or you're not getting the points. It's really confusing because you don't know how it's going to be. My sister's a teacher, so I try and talk to her about this stuff all the time, and she's confused by it a lot too. And she's 28, the old, wise 28-year-old. So because teachers get no training in how to do this, and they're combining so many different things together, every grade could mean something different for every child in every class, which adds to the stress that they feel. So not only do I have to understand all the content that I'm taught in my class, I have to now understand every teacher's unique way of grading. In this class, if I don't hand in on time, I lose 5 points. In this class, it's 20. In this class, I can do a retake. In this class, I can't do. It's all over the place because, of course, teachers don't get any training. So we're all doing our best, right? Each teacher is trying to infuse their grade with meaning and values. It's just they're all doing it differently and trying to combine so many things together in a tiny little container. And that adds to the stress that our students feel. A constant quest for points, and every teacher's doing it differently. This is a quote from a high school student. In my life, the thing that causes me the most stress is the amount that teaching revolves around points and grades. And that is all because we continue to use a system that is 100 years old. Fortunately, since then, we have learned a lot more about what effective teaching and learning is. And we've learned a lot more about what are effective ways to grade that are actually more fair to all students. So I want to talk about what that is now. So our framework for equitable grading has 3 pillars. The first is that grades are accurate reflections of a student's academic performance. The second is we want our grades to be bias resistant, so they counteract institutional biases and prevent implicit biases from infecting the grade. And the third is that grades are motivational, that they build students' intrinsic motivation and their sense of efficacy. So again, there's a whole lot in this, and I wanted to share exactly what the pillars say, but we are not going to be able to go into huge depth with all of this. But I wanted to give an example of a more equitable practice and how that contrasts with what we traditionally do. So a common grading practice is that we average performance over time. So let me take an example. So let's say I have a 9th grade class as a teacher, and I'm teaching how to write a persuasive essay, right? And let's say I'm teaching 5 essays over this persuasive essay unit, okay? So let's say I have 2 students. I have Maria and I have Ellis, right? And there you can see that Maria performed highly all the way through on every essay, and Ellis didn't do very well at the beginning, but he gradually got better and better at writing a persuasive essay. So traditionally what we do in grading is we average performance over time, right? We say Maria's average is an A and Ellis's average is like a C+ when I average those together, okay? So the first thing that's weird about this is that Ellis actually never wrote a C+ quality essay, right? A C+ never described how good he was at essay writing, but when we average, we create some new way to describe what a student can do that may actually never have been what they actually do. And we want our grades to be accurate, right? We want them to be an accurate reflections of students' academic performance, right? So in this case, if I sat down Maria and Ellis, and I had to say, can Maria and Ellis can each of them write an A-level essay, persuasive essay? The answer is yes, they both can write an A-level essay, right? They have both learned to write an exemplary essay. So if I want my grade to be accurate, I need to describe their performance by the most recent performance, right? If I were to say that Ellis is a C+, that actually isn't how strong he is at writing, right? He's actually at an A level. And I know you have tons of questions about that, but I want to actually run this through the 2 other pillars. We want our grades to be bias resistant, right? We want to counteract institutional biases and prevent implicit biases from infecting the grade, right? So we're just going to talk about institutional biases, and I want to just say a little bit about what that is, right? That is when the practices or systems operate in ways that result in certain groups being advantaged or favored and others being disadvantaged or devalued, right? So this is not when an individual is not treating someone fairly, right? This is when a structure, a system is actually resulting in certain groups being advantaged and certain groups being disadvantaged, all right? So you may say like, well, what does that have to do with averaging, Joe? Right? Averaging is just taking some numbers and, doing some math. So let me talk about what makes averaging performance over time more biased, more institutional biased. All right. So when I think about Maria and Ellis, right, let's take a step back. So let's say before 9th grade started, Maria enrolled in a summer writing program at the local community college, right? Her parents could afford it. They could get her there. She didn't have other responsibilities. She didn't know how to write a persuasive essay, but she learned in this program, right? She learned how to write a great persuasive essay. She walks into class on the first day, they're teaching the persuasive essay unit, and she writes A-level essays, right? So traditionally, what we do is we average performance over time. We don't average performance over all time. Like, she wasn't born knowing how to write a persuasive essay, but we're looking at it from the day she comes into the class. And for Medea, she had lots of resources and support before she came in. So averaging was just fine for her. For Ellis, he didn't go to that summer writing program. Parents couldn't afford it. His caregivers couldn't get him there. He had to work. He was staying with his grandparents in Arizona, taking care of younger siblings. It doesn't matter. He didn't go to that summer writing program. So he now comes into class, and of course he doesn't know how to write a persuasive essay, but by the end he learns how to do it, right? But what we're doing when we average performance over time is we're saying all the disparities that are happening. Some students can go to community college writing programs and get more support. Some can't. We're going to bring all those disparities into the classroom and make it easier for Medea and harder for Ellis, even though Ellis learned how to write the essay, right? So if we want to be more equitable, we want our grading to counteract those disparities. We want to only look at the most recent performance. So we can say to Ellis, it doesn't matter if you didn't know how to if you didn't get any support before you came into the class. What only matters is, did you learn how to write it by the end of the learning? And I know you have questions about that. I want to talk about the last pillar, which is around motivation, right? We want to build students' intrinsic motivation, right? We know that for a student like Ellis, when he gets a D on his first essay, for a lot of students, they do not rally and work their way up to an A, right? They get their first grade and they know how the math works in school, right? They know that their performance is going to be averaged. So even if they learn how to they write the best essay by the end, they have this anchor that they're pulling with them all the way through their learning. And a lot of students will say, well, forget it. Like, it's going to take way too much for me to salvage my grade. Even if I know how to do everything by the end, I still have this weighting me down. And that actually reinforces everything we know about motivation. Here's a couple of quotes from some researchers. The first is from Geneva Gay, who's a titan in cultural responsive and culturally sustaining pedagogy. She talks about each failure by a student confirms what they already know about the task, that they can't do it, right? It's not news to Ellis that he didn't know how to write an essay. He didn't know it when he turned the thing in. And this is a quote from another researcher, Thomas Guskey, who writes about, instead of prompting greater effort, low grades more often cause students to withdraw from learning. And in fact, even though we may feel like, giving a student a low grade will teach them a lesson and they'll work harder, there's actually no research to support that. There is zero research to support that. All the research says the opposite, which is that when students get low grades, it demotivates them. The only research that supports it is for a student who always get A's and they get a low grade, they scramble like mad to not get A's, to not get a low grade. But for everybody else, the research is overwhelming that it actually demotivates. And we say in schools a lot, mistakes are good and necessary for learning. We love mistakes. You've got to make mistakes in order to learn. And yet our traditional grading practices contradict this, right? We say to Ellis, we love it. You've made all these mistakes and you learned from them. You got low grades at the beginning and learned how to write this persuasive essay. That's exactly what's supposed to happen. And we're going to punish you for that because we're going to include all of those mistakes in your grading calculation. And if we want to be more equitable, we want to be more accurate, bias resistant, motivational, we say, yes, those mistakes aren't going to be held against you. That's what's supposed to happen. You're only going to be having your grade reflect where you are at the end of your learning. And here's a couple of quotes from teachers about this kind of work. One kid started late in the class, was scoring low, and was playing catch up. For the first time, I was giving him hope that he could still pass. And it makes a huge difference when you have hope in the classroom. Students don't give up, and it changes the dynamic of the classroom. And we see this over and over, that when students are not, their work is not averaged over time, they become more motivated to work hard and succeed. So that was just a quick example of these three pillars: making our grades accurate reflections of a student's academic performance, being bias resistant, and being motivational. And again, I know that there are tons of questions you may have, and you may also feel like, well, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Or, what would this mean? Or you got to be kidding me, right? All of these are the same reactions that teachers have when they first hear about this. And this is just one example of more equitable grading practices. There are many others. And I'm just going to share some examples very, very quickly. So it's where the grade doesn't include things that are outside of a student's academic performance. So it doesn't include the 0 to 100 scale or student behaviors or how they do on homework or group grades or extra credit, right? It's where the grade only includes the student's academic performance, right? Where the performance outcomes are explicit. What do we expect from you to be able to know and do? And being clear about what those are. Using rubrics. Some of you may be familiar with your children having rubrics, and you should ask them, like, do you have a rubric for that? That's used all over in this district. Having retakes and redos, multiple chances to learn, using the 0 to 4 scale instead of the 0 to 100 scale, and thinking about formative feedback differently. Just because something isn't included in the grade doesn't mean that students can't learn from it and that teachers can't use the feedback to help students learn. And this is really hard stuff. But what happens when across the country, so as I said, we've done this all over in urban districts, rural, suburban, large, small, charter schools, all over, and post-secondary and community colleges and universities. And over, the same thing happens, is that there's a reduction in grade inflation and a reduction in grade deflation at the same time, and a reduction in achievement disparities. And what we find often is that the grades that teachers assign become more closely correlated with the standardized test results. And although I don't think standardized tests are like the answer to all life's problems, it means something when the scores that students get on the tests become closer to what the teachers assigned. Students tell us that they are more motivated and they are less stressed through this kind of grading. And they talk about their progress in terms of the content. So students no longer say, oh, I'm just 2 points away from an A. They say, if I can just write a persuasive essay that cites evidence more clearly, I'll have an A, right? They start talking about their learning in the language of the course, not in just a bunch of numbers I got to try and get. And the relationships with teachers get stronger. Teachers talk about it. I just had a workshop with a bunch of your wonderful teachers who are doing this work and trying these things out. And they all say, like, this is difficult and causes us confusion, but very quickly, they become a lot more confident in using in their grading through these practices. They argue with students less about it. Students become much more partners in the work, and their classrooms feel less stressful. So this work, now to help explain what is actually happening in Santa Barbara, I'm going to talk about the design of the professional learning, and then you're going to get to hear from some of the folks in the district about that learning. So the way we're approaching this is, how can we build the education and research leg of how teachers decide how to grade, not just their own experiences and not just what they're doing in the software, but what does the research say? And so teachers this year have been engaged in professional learning, where they started with a 2-day kickoff, and we meet every other month after school for a 2-hour workshop with a cohort of teachers, not all of them, just one cohort of teachers. And every teacher then does what is called action research. So it's where teachers try the practices, collect data around what happens, and then share back with their colleagues. In addition, every teacher gets individual coaching with a teacher who's experienced in the practices from across the country, who can help them grade more equitably, more accurately, with less bias, and in more motivational ways. And it looks kind of like this, right? Where teachers are engaging in these ideas and trying out different practices over time, so that by the end of the year, there's a body of evidence about how do these practices work in the classrooms in Santa Barbara for these teachers. And it's giving them space to do this. So the district administration and the building principals and administrators are creating the space so that the teachers can engage in this learning. So now it's time for you all to hear from some folks who are actually doing it. I'm going to pass the baton to Sean Carey, I believe. We'll start with a teacher.
Maggie Light. You can introduce Maggie Light.
All right, Maggie, you have the floor.
Hi, can you all hear me? Yes? All right, excellent. I just want to say the first thing that struck me when Joe Feldman came to the school for our 2-day workshop was that it is imperative that you get students to do the work, that you cannot not have work to assess. And that struck me because I do think that's a big challenge for some students more than others. So to start with the motivation factor first, I made a point of directing my attention to making commitments and agreements with my students instead of demands and requirements. So my commitment to them is that I will do whatever I can to support them, guide them, give them feedback. And the agreements are that they make choices to engage in the learning process. So one of the most important factors for me in this is the feedback element. I'm an English teacher at Santa Barbara High. I did the 4-point grading scale. I don't use the 0 to 100%. I use a 50% as on my bottom grade. And I take work at all times of the semester or the quarter. And a lot of what was in the grading for equity, I was already practicing. But for me, what was really a change was the feedback aligned with grading the most recent work. And that transformed my classroom. For one thing, getting them to do the work, I insist when we have a work time, when we're working on an assessment or an assignment, I insist that I get everybody's work before they leave the room. They have to submit whatever they've got. And that's my first sort of talon into their work. Because if I feel like if you can give really good feedback, even if it's just a couple of sentences, you get them realizing that you're invested in them and they have a chance, because a lot of times when it's not a lot of work, it means they're struggling. So I get right away, I often see where they're struggling and can help them. It helps target my assistance when I walk around the class and get feedback. I believe that at least in English, everything should be rewritten as often as possible until you're satisfied. So I let that retakes and redos, I do that all the time. In fact, I consider it part of the process. The thing that I'm working on right now that's sort of still a challenge for me is how to make rubrics more instructional for the students, rather than just marking where they are in the learning process. I want the rubrics to guide them to moving forward. And I'm working with my coach on that, which she's been very helpful. And she's helping me see maybe the rubrics and my feedback, combining those two, so that instead of maybe just descriptors of each grade point, I actually have written feedback for that specific standard in how they produced it, that particular student. So that's what I'm working on. I love grading for equity. I've been begging that to be happening in our district for a long time. But like I said, a lot of it is you have to go in there with this motivation, and you've got to have that feedback be part of the relationship you have with your students. Anyway, I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Ms. Light. Our next speaker will be Assistant Principal Dan DuPont, Assistant Principal at Santa Barbara High.
Good evening, everybody. Dan DuPont, Assistant Principal at Santa Barbara High School. I want to echo what Maggie said, that when we first heard from Mr. Feldman in the summer, his example of the two students that ended up with an A and a C+, it really struck me. And I'm excited to expand this work so that we can get to a point where Maggie Light, as a 10th grade teacher, is working across with other 10th grade English teachers where they all are practicing grading for equity, that we can come to a point where I can be confident as an administrator that an A in Maggie Light's class equals the same level of learning as an A in another 10th grade English teacher's class. It's not an indication of that student's ability to turn in the homework on time. It's an indication that by the time the final grade is submitted at the end of the course, you have reached what Maggie Light and her colleagues have defined as equitable, as exemplary work. And I'm excited that we would be able to do that with multiple sections of English 10, multiple sections of physics, any class where we have multiple teachers teaching multiple sections of the same thing. I'm excited that we can actually bring a common definition to what it is. In preparation for tonight, I was talking to some of the teachers on campus that participate in the Grading for Equity work. And I had a really informative conversation with a history teacher where she was telling me, back when she did points, the total cumulative points, she's been a longtime teacher and that was her process earlier on in her career. She had this process where 2 weeks before the end of the term, she would stop adding things into the grade book because she didn't want her students to figure out, oh, I only need to get a 67% on the final exam in order to get an A. And while I can certainly on some level identify with that, but there's something about it as an administrator, as a teacher, as a parent myself, it feels off. We want to be able to let students know on any given day, how well are they doing in class? They should be able to know when they walk out of any class, how did I do that day? And how am I doing overall in the class? And this Grading for Equity work, where the rubrics that you're using are well-defined, that you know exactly what a 4, what above grade level standing, what that represents, what a 3 represents, what is at grade level, what does a 2 represent, where you're approaching the grade level standard. I'm excited that we will soon get to a point where I can confidently say that yes, an A in Maggie Light's English 10 class means the exact same thing, and it represents the same level of learning in any other English 10 class. And it is used as a motivator. It is, to the degree possible, resistant to the bias, and it is accurate to a student's level of learning, not that student's ability to turn in all the late work that they missed when they had to leave for 10 days because they unfortunately caught COVID, something that we've had to deal with a lot. There's just so much promise in this work, and I'm excited to see the beginnings here, and I'm even more excited to see how we can get to expand it. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I'm going to share one more slide around this, which is a quote from a history teacher, not from Santa Barbara. This work has pushed me and all of the teachers to be more equitable and transparent. Students at the same school should be able to have the same grading system, to be able to understand that grading system and know exactly how it supports learning. This is just scratching the surface. As I said, it's incredibly complex, and I invite folks to Google me. You can read articles that are out there about this work. I want to talk about 2 more things lastly before we go to Q&A. Things that come up a lot, some misconceptions. So the first is that this is actually lowering expectations. This is lowering standards because of things like retakes or things like that. And when we do this work and we see that the A rate goes down a little bit or the DNF rate goes down, and we talk to teachers, we say, well, what do you think might be misconceptions around this? And the teachers will say, oh, people are going to think that we lowered our standards because we had retakes or because we allowed students to hand in things late without having a penalty in the grade. And then I ask them, well, what should I tell them? And they say, we actually have made our classes more rigorous. In the past, if a student didn't know something very well, but they did extra credit, or they didn't know something very well, but they got a lot of help doing their homework, or they didn't know something very well, but they raised their hand a lot and contributed, that would all compensate, right? So even though the student may have actually not known things very much, that lifted their grade up, right? And what this is saying is that, no, the grade is only going to reflect the level of understanding of the course. So it's actually increasing the rigor. Same thing with retakes. Some would say, oh, the retake actually makes it easy because now students can get multiple chances. But that's actually making things more rigorous, because what we're saying is you can't just do your best on one try and then you get to walk away and do the next thing. Like, you actually have to keep working and keep learning. And that's actually how the professional world works, right? When you get your driver's license, if you don't pass it, you go back the next time and you got to study a little harder. Or you didn't pass the bar exam, you go back and you do it again and you work a little harder to do it. So it's very much a more authentic preparation for the professional world in many cases. The other thing that comes up a lot is that some families and parents, and sometimes students, it makes them nervous, reasonably, when a system of grading is going to change. because there's a lot at stake. I want to make sure my child's competitive. I want to make sure my child has every opportunity, and my child has been doing very well in school. Like, is this going to jeopardize that? And over, we talk with administrators and families and parents and students about how this doesn't mean that your grade will go down at all. All it is doing is saying the mirror that we've been holding up, when we've told you what your grade is, it has been blurry because we've been including whether you did your homework or whether you handed it in, even if you had a tutor help you, or if you had a parent help you, or if you did it by yourself, or you did it in group, it added all that to it. Or whether you brought in food for the canned food drive, and how did you do on the test, and did you raise your hand? It combined so many things that it wasn't a clear mirror. Now we're going to give you a clear mirror of exactly where you are so that you can respond, right? If you thought you were doing great, you kept doing great. Now, if you find out that your content is weak, you now have the opportunity to actually grow and do better. And what we find is that when students go to the next level, that it's very clear to them what's expected of them. It's not like I did all the extra stuff, so now I get to the next grade level and I'm not prepared. Now you are totally prepared because the teachers and the standards they set are calibrated so that you are ready for the next level, whether it be the next grade level or high school or college. So people find that it's actually better, more rigorous and authentic preparation and feedback for the next level of students' academic careers, and doesn't make them any less competitive. It actually makes them much better prepared as well as competitive. So with that, again, I'm just so grateful to have been able to connect with you all and share a little bit about this work. And I hope you continue to ask questions and explore. And now we have our Q&A time. So what we're going to do is we have Sean Carey, who I think will introduce herself very quickly, and then we'll moderate, and we'll either respond to questions directly or forward them to me or to the teacher administrator that you heard.
Thanks so much, Joe. My name is Sean Carey, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Secondary Education. And I want to first of all just thank Joe for being here, for sharing his time and expertise with us, and for sharing his time and expertise with our teachers who are participating in the cohort. It's great to have Maggie and Dan here as well, speaking to their experience with our professional learning this year. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I really appreciate the questions. I'm going to toss some of the questions that you've been asking throughout the presentation tonight to Joe. And in some cases, I'm going to take a stab at some myself as relevant. So the first one's for Joe, and it's really about what data that you use to make the claim that teachers don't get training in how to grade or don't know how to grade, is the wording.
So some of it is anecdotal. So I didn't get any training. Every time we go to a session, we say teachers didn't get any training, and they all say, that's right, we didn't get any training. They may have had courses on assessment and curriculum design, but nothing specifically about grading. Now that's starting to change, fortunately. We also did a survey looking at curriculum across what we believe is a representative group of teacher training programs at different universities, and found that there's no course that is specifically about grading. And in assessment courses, it's either not mentioned or it's mentioned very sort of secondarily. So that's what we base it on. And teachers continue to validate that this is true. And interestingly, they get angry because they realize that they never had access to the research on grading. And they are so grateful when a district makes this resource available to them. It fills a gap in their learning that they are so appreciative can get filled. And interestingly, a number of teachers will tell us that by doing this work, it actually reconnects them to why they went into teaching. No teacher went into teaching because they wanted to every day count every student who is raising their hand, or taking off 5 points for each day something is late, or spending all this time like doing all these intricate calculations of a grade, right? They went into this because they love students and they love their content. And this allows them to simplify some of the acts of grading that they've made so convoluted and complex, and actually make their work harder.
Okay, great, thanks. And there were some questions about just the number of teacher participants who makes up the teacher cohort that I've tried to answer, and also teachers' reactions to participating in this learning. But I think you've characterized some of those, and we also heard about Maggie's experience. There were a couple of questions around just the anxiety that it produces to think about de-emphasizing tasks that students perform other than just exams or tests or things that really show, ultimately what they've learned in a course. Giving weight to categories like homework and participation, especially for students who have been maybe historically poor test takers, is causing some concern for one of our participants. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so this comes up all the time. So some people worry that, okay, well, like in the case of Ellis, right? So if we say at the end of a unit, there's an exam, and that's measures how students are at the end of their learning, and Ellis does badly because he has has test anxiety, that's really going to hurt him. And one of the things we talk about is that the grade, again, and I say this over and over, the grade is supposed to accurately reflect where a student is in their learning. So if I'm a teacher and I see that the student has been doing well and learning and growing, and maybe even the day before the exam, they showed great understanding, and when Ellis handed in his rough draft, he did great, and when he handed in this, he did great, and then they do badly on a test, well, then I know as a teacher that something's wrong, right? My job is not to just enter scores from tests, right? The test is a means by which I can understand where a student is in their learning. And if that shows weird data that doesn't fit with what happened before, I now can go to the student. I can say, well, what's going on? I see that you did great yesterday in the review session, but you didn't do great on this test. What happened? And I can learn about, well, maybe the student gets test anxiety, or maybe their younger brother had a fever and was up all night, and so they just couldn't concentrate, or there was some tragedy in their family. I mean, it starts to build this relationship and this openness between teachers and students. Plus, it gets teachers to think more expansively about how to assess. So we find that what teachers start to do is they start to expand what I call the aperture, like on a camera lens. You can make it bigger or smaller to get in more light or less light. How can they expand the aperture of assessment? How can I open up more ways that students can demonstrate what they know? So I'm not relying on a test either, because it may not give me enough information about how certain students do because of something going on in their life or because of anxiety. So teachers start using multiple kinds of assessment. So if I want to know whether or not a student has learned the social, economic, and political causes of World War II, I might have a test, but I also might have an essay, and I might have a project, and maybe they can do a video, and maybe they can do a presentation, and maybe they can do artwork, right? All of these ways where I can now better understand what level of understanding my students have, and not rely on just a single measure, particularly if it adds stress and our students aren't good test takers. Great question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. What role then do individual accommodations play in the classroom, maybe for students with disabilities or other specialized learning needs? How does that fit in?
So for those who may not be aware, so when students have need an accommodation or have something written into a specific individual learning plan for them, there's actually two choices. They can have an accommodation, which means that the teacher needs to make some adjustments, but the standard is the same. So if you're supposed to identify the political, social, economic causes of World War II, you still have to hit that. It's just, we might find different ways for you to access the information and different ways for you to show what you know. So this all fits all beautifully with how we talk about this. And teachers who work with students with special needs say this is what they've been advocating for forever. Like, why would we say if you turn in something late, it should lower your grade? Why would we say to students, if it takes you longer to learn, sorry, you don't get to learn anymore. We're going to stop you from learning, right? This is about expanding and letting students continue to learn, or to have multiple ways of students showing what they know. There's also some students who actually require what are called modifications in their curriculum because of their individual education plan. So this is saying the student, for some reason, for traumatic brain injury or something, biological or mental, physical, is unable to meet the same standard. So this is saying, even though our standard is that students have to identify the political, social, economic causes of World War II, we actually are going to adjust that a little bit lower for this student because they're actually incapable of hitting it. And that's something that fits in very much with this. It is about clarifying and being explicit with students exactly what's expected from them. And every student, if they see a target and the target doesn't move, they can hit the target. And it helps clarify for the teacher as well. This is actually what the student is supposed to know and be able to do.
Okay, a couple of follow-ups about just, things that are maybe novel for people to hear and are just kind of coming across as seeming and feeling maybe unfair. So how do students learn then to turn things in on time? If that's not something that is consistent and that is, a hard line. And how it seems counterintuitive. I'm just going to use the exact verbiage from the question. It can seem counterintuitive or even disrespectful for students who are turning things in on time, or who are doing what they're supposed to be doing, for people who are not doing that to get to have a starting point of 50%. Can you speak to those kind of related questions? The relative fairness of these policies in place.
Yeah. So this comes up all the time, right? So the student who says, so Medea, right? The person who's thinking about Medea and saying, well, look, Medea got it right on the first time. Why would she have the same grade as Ellis, who took a lot longer to learn and learned only at the end, right? And I think part of this is helping us recognize that learning is not a race, and that the grade shouldn't reflect how fast someone learned something, but whether or not they learned it. And this plays out in other ways. So an example that was given, like, well, what if students turn in something on time versus late, right? So why would those students be able to get the same grade? And it's the same idea that learning is not a race. Now, how do we, now the other side of this is, well, how do we teach students to turn something on time? Well, the question presupposes that it is always within a student's control that they can turn in something in on time, right? So there are some students for whom there are interruptions to their lives that they have no control over. And there are some for whom their lives are so busy that they actually are unable to. So we have on one hand, the student who is on the soccer team and in the musical, right? That student gets home during soccer and musical season at 10:30 at night, right? If that student, would we expect that student to stay up at no matter what, so that they can hand in something by the next day? Or would we say and extend grace and say, look, that's okay. We want your best work. We don't want your rushed work. We don't want you to be overly stressed, right? What we care about is that you learn. And if it isn't exactly on our timeline because you have these commitments that you believe will help you have a full, vibrant life, we don't want to get in the way of that. Now, for that student, it is not though they have no consequences, because they still have to do the work, right? Now they got to do that work as well as the additional work that they have. So it is not without consequences. It's just that we're not penalizing them in the grade, right? On the other hand, you have students for whom their lives have more interruptions that they cannot control, right? Maybe they had to take care of their younger siblings because their parents work at night, or there was some interrupting tragedy that actually made it so they couldn't get the work done, or their power was shut off, or things like that. And we don't want to make a student's grade reflective of the circumstances that they were born into, right? So if we now say, well, if something like that happens, that's okay. We're going to give you more time to do it, because what matters is that you learn, not having the grade reflect your circumstances. And it may seem counterintuitive that, well, students won't learn to hand things in on time if they don't get penalized for a deadline. And I think what's important to realize, it's not that there's no penalty, right? There are natural consequences to not handing something in on time. You still have to do the work. And now you have more work to do and you have to manage your time even more. It's just that we don't want to put it in the grade, because if we do, the student who hands in something exemplary but a day late could have the same grade as the student who hands in something that's not as strong but on time. And we would not want two students to get identical grades who have entirely different profiles of their learning. You mentioned one other, I think there was another. Okay. I think I got it.
It may come up in these subsequent questions again in a new way. We have a couple questions just about how these types of practices articulate with the traditional scales we have and in scoring that we have. So we have the A to F scale that most people are familiar with. We talk sometimes about the 4-point scale, as you mentioned, but the College Board uses a 5-point scale for AP classes. Sort of how are we supposed to make sense of applying these practices, and then the way that students demonstrating their mastery of their learning shows up on different kinds of grading scales and metrics that we use that are like a currency, as you've said, in our system.
So what ultimately should happen is that for every course outcome, so I keep using that example of identifying the political, social, economic causes of World War II. Ultimately, we get to a point where the teacher says, this is what a 4 is, or an A level understanding is of the political, social, economic cause of the World War II. And this is what B level understanding is. And this is C level understanding. And this is D level understanding. It makes it so explicit and transparent to students and their families that there is no doubt ever of where a student is on that. Right now, a lot of students have no idea what grade they have and are just trying to get as many points as possible and just hoping that they got the right answers, right, on the test. What this is saying is that if you want to have an A-level understanding, you need to be able to identify political, social, economic causes of World War II. And here are some examples of that. This is what it means. And this is B, C, D. And that explicitness and transparency is hugely guiding for students and their families so that they can know how to support their students and know where their students are. Now, it takes a while to get there. We are currently traditionally in a very abstract scale of 0 to 100, where your student has an 87%. 87% of what, right? 87% says really nothing about what level of understanding your child has. It only means that your student has earned 87% of the points. That could be of 100 points, 1,000, 268, 14. We don't know, right? And this is not a bashing of teachers, because this is what we've all grown up on. And we didn't have access to the research around why the 0 to 100 grading scale is so faulty, in fact. So should I spend a minute talking about the 0 to 100 grading scale's faultiness? I'll spend a minute. Okay, so I'm gonna have to use my paper here. So just give me a second here. Okay. Okay. I prepared a quick visual aid. Okay. So, oh my gosh, I hope you can see it. Okay, so here we go. We've got our A, B, C, D, and F, and we've got the 190, 80, 70, 60. And that's the grading scale, but that's actually not all of it. I want to show you down here. There's the 0, okay? So the way we have, the 0 to 100 scale is built so that between 0 and 60 is an F, right? So we are devoting almost 2/3 of our grading scale to describing levels of failure, and maybe only a part of the scale and a small part of the scale, maybe a third, to describing gradations of success. So already something's weird about this, right? Do we care the difference between a 14 and a 19 and a 26 and a 31 and a 46 and a 56, right? We have so many gradations of failure that when we use this scale, we're actually using a scale that is disproportionately allocated and oriented towards failure. So when students have zeros for like a missing assignment or a very low score, it disproportionately pulls down the grade. Let me give you an example. Forgive my handwriting. Okay. Oops, wait, let me do one more thing here, make it even fancier. Okay, here we go. Sorry for my rudimentary visual aid. Let's just try this. Okay. So if a student got a B, B, and an F, and we said, well, if a student got a B, B, and an F, what would be an average of that? Well, something like a C minus or something like that, right? It seems reasonable. But if I put that B, B, and an F into the 0 to 100 scale, and I gave a 0 for missing assignments, right? Oops, sorry about that. Darn it. So if I had, sorry, let me do it one more time. Instead of a B, B, and an F, we put it into the grading scale of a 0 to 100, which is an 85, 85, and a 0, right? The average of an 85, 85, and a 0 is 57%. That means that when we average an 85, an 85, and a 0, a B, B, and an F, the average is an F, right? We would never say that we would average a B, B, and an F and get an F. But when we use a 0 to 100 scale, because we have disproportionately oriented the scale, we are using a scale that's disproportionately oriented toward failure, we are automatically, by its very structure, disproportionately lowering grades. A lot of researchers talk about it being the atomic 0, right? When a 0 is to signify missing assignments, it disproportionately punishes and pulls down grades. And it's a mathematically unsound grading structure. One of the interesting ironies is that the 0 to 100 scale is not used in elementary school, and it's not used in college or the professional world. In college, it's scaled so much so it actually doesn't represent the scale. And in the professional world, nobody uses a 0 to 100 scale. It's not used in any professional evaluations of employees. It's not used on, as some of the major competency exams, the bar exam, nursing, architecture, medical boards, driver's license. Nobody uses a 0 to 100 scale to describe levels of competence, except in grades 6 through 12. There is no reason, there is nothing sacred about the 0 to 100 scale, and it actually is mathematically unsound and disproportionately punishes students when they have zeros. And so the alternative is to use either a minimum 50, which actually makes the gradations more even, 90, 80, 70, 60, 50. Or what I like more actually is the 0 to 4. It's very simple. It's the GPA scale, so all the students know it. It's much more similar to elementary school. It's so simple and can be written in a rubric. And that's part of this work. So I think I might have gone on a little tangent, but here's a little mini lesson on the 0 to 100.
It's great because we had a follow-up question on the 4-point grading scale as well. I'm going to ask, because of our time, a couple of questions. I'm going to lump them together that in my mind have to do with process and this idea of sort of which teachers are participating in this and isn't, maybe potential unevenness, either from subject to subject or classroom to classroom. The 2 students in English 10 or one's in an honor section or not, or even from elementary to secondary, with there being the participant is observing and commenting on it and making appreciation for the fact that right process is often rewarded in the elementary grades. And how can we make sure that that doesn't get undone in the secondary grades? So just, sort of as we undertake this work as a district on more equitable grading, what about our process and ensuring consistency, again, which kind of points to fairness at the end of the day?
So what we know from traditional grading, what's happening is that every teacher grades differently. And when teachers start doing this work, they worry that, well, this is going to have different teachers grading differently, even though that's something that's already happening anyway. The difference is that this professional development is structured in an action research design so that there is evidence that teachers are collecting about the benefits of the practices that they can then bring to their colleagues and help move toward a broader policy change, either within their department or their grade level or in their school and ultimately in the district. But to its credit, the district is not saying, well, the research says we should grade equitably. So guess what? Tomorrow, everybody has to grade equitably, right? Because that is depriving not only students and families from understanding the why around this work, but it is depriving teachers of the professionalism that is required for them to deeply understand the why and how to do this. These aren't technical changes. These are deeper changes that affect instruction and curriculum and the day-to-day work that they do with students. So it takes a long time for teachers to build up the capacity and understanding and evidence to become comfortable and adept at using the practices. What happens though is that teachers start sharing with each other how this is working and look at how great this is operating, and it starts to build this coherence across the district over time. And the district is thinking about ways to expand this work more formally in the future through its own internal systems, as well as potentially with replicating this.
Okay, great. And then the second process question has to do with the student experience as just in terms of adapting to changes in general. Of course, all of us, and we're particularly concerned about our young people and the changes they've undergone. So as we, look to even do some of what you're suggesting seems to folks like a paradigm shift. And how well does that translate? Well, just A, taking in a change like that, and B, how well does that translate to college and the post-secondary world, including the professional world, and this idea that there is a standard, whether it's 60% or whatever the standard is that you must meet as a minimum competency. So what are your thoughts about just how, sort of the process concerns that some folks are voicing and asking about in terms of having these kinds of experiences in school, and then how they translate to those other settings, and will they be well prepared for those other settings?
Yeah, so this requires deep engagement and partnering with students. Most of the time, students have no power at all and have no voice in the grading. They are beholden to anything the teacher says, and they feel very little agency and partnership, unfortunately. And they all have opinions and experiences with grading that are so insightful. And so part of this work, when teachers are talking to students about this and introducing this, we strongly encourage them to actually engage students in the why. Why is it that we are not having homework performance included in the grade? If it's not included in the grade, why should I do homework? If it's not included in the grade, how does this homework actually prepare me to be successful when it's time for an assessment? How is homework a practice? Just like when I go and shoot free throws for an hour in my driveway, no one's tallying up the number of points and then bringing it to the game and saying, hey, can we add these points to the game? Right? This is much more authentic with what the students experience and what the professional world demands, which is you're expected to be able to know and do certain things. We are going to give you opportunities to learn those things and support you throughout and give you feedback. But what matters to us is that you understand that all of this practice work is for you to learn how you best learn, to learn how to apply yourself and to understand the different aspects of the content, to try them, to get feedback so that you ultimately can perform. And that's how the professional world is. Nobody says to you, tonight when you go home, you're going to have to do some of these tasks. And actually, I'm going to look at your practicing of the tasks and I'm going to include that in your job evaluation. No, people look at how do you perform in the actual job requirements. Whatever practice it took you to be able to do that is hugely important, and it's not included in the evaluation itself. Only have you learned how to do the tasks that you're assigned. And it's that relationship and that building of understanding with students that actually builds this deeper intrinsic motivation for them to do the homework. No one believes that when you don't include homework in the grade, students do homework. And yet every time it happens, every time students continue to do homework. It may drop off at the beginning because they're not really sure about this new system where they don't get the 5 points for doing the homework like they used to. But then they realize they need to do the homework if they're going to do well on the next quiz or on the next assessment. So it starts to build this deeper understanding of, oh, when a professor assigns me that I got to be able to do this problem set, I got to do whatever it takes to learn it. I got to practice with whatever friends I have, look for more problems if I need it, whatever I need to do so that I deeply understand it. So when the assessment comes, I'm ready.
Well, thank you so much. One theme that is coming through in the chat and in the Q&A is that this has been a very thought-provoking presentation. So lots of really, we've had some really general questions and we've had some very specific questions. So thank you for fielding all of those. Also, I want to represent, because you haven't been able to track it as you've been responding to me and presenting, that there are many comments of appreciation too, just appreciation that we're thinking about how learning, especially the motivational aspects is what's being represented in the chat comments of what it means to just be thinking about each individual learner and what will best meet the needs of individual learners. So much more to come for sure, more learning for us all to do together. And with that, I just want to thank you once again. I don't know if you have any parting thoughts or final words, but anything else you need to say before I just say?
I'll just say thanks. I mean, their questions are right on target. I mean, ask your students about, or your children about this. It's just exciting work and so important to having them become their whole selves and less stressed out and more focused on what matters in school is the learning. So again, I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Santa Barbara Unified for engaging in this work and inviting you all to be part of it. So thank you. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joe.